Welcome to the APA 2016 Carl Jaspers Society. We have an Author Meets Critics with Paul, and we're going to have the America, the Philosophical, really fantastic book. We have some great comments. I'll name the people down in the order that they are seated here. So we have John Kaag, University of Massachusetts, Lowell, Jacquelyn Kelsey, CSU Berkeley, or not Berkeley, CSU Bakersfield. I wish there was a Kegley, sorry about that. Paul at Stetson University, Mary Rorty, Stanford, and our author, Carlin. So what I'm going to do is each speaker, I have an order here that we're going to follow, is going to get 30 minutes. Then we'll have some discussion. So basically a 15-minute critique and then discussion of each critique as we go down. We're missing one of our speakers, so we'll have some time, plenty of time afterwards for a more general discussion. And looking forward to hearing where we go with this.
I took originally I thought it was going to be 5 years. It took 10 years to write this book. As some of you know, I have had a career in the media as well as in philosophy. I was the literary critic of the Philadelphia Inquirer for 25 years. And so I was writing this book for a mass audience as well as the audience within the philosophy profession. I was very much interested in this book falling into a tradition of cultural history and cultural critique of the American intellectual tradition. So I wasn't just addressing, philosophers, but a rather long tradition of dissing the level of intellectual back and forth in American culture. So, books like Richard Hofstadter's Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, more recent books by less esteemed thinkers, such as a book called Idiot America. But I was interested in angering people in the philosophy profession, or at least some of them. The initial reaction to my book by a lot of people in the profession was, oh, great, America the Philosophical, a book about us, a book celebrating us. Then when people read it, they figured out that this was a book that was more or less claiming America is a great philosophical culture, not because of you people, but in spite of you people. So I have found a lot of interesting back and forth with people at APA. I've been coming to APA now, I think, oh my God, for almost 40 years since I was a student. I love APA. So I'm really very grateful to everybody for taking time. We're all so busy with our own work. I mean, anytime you do put some effort into looking at someone else's work, it's a real gift and a real act of generosity. So I'm really grateful to everybody on the panel and look forward to some good back and forth tonight.
Now, the direction I'm going to go in my few minutes is about a philosophy that emphasizes direction. I'm going to get there, but first I'd like to begin with a story. Colleagues of a certain age may remember Jeffrey Holder's ad for 7-Up, the Uncola. He presented himself with forceful authority from an unnamed tropical locale while instructing the audience with simple direction. These are cola nuts, he would say, with precise diction, while holding one brown nut gracefully. Offering a simple if quirky comparison, Holder then presented a lemon and a lime, stating calmly, these are uncola nuts. They grow here too. And then he added that they are rather larger, juicier, wild, all that. In naming the unphilosophy of the American intellectual landscape, Carlin Romano is the Jeffrey Holder of philosophers, even if his advertisements for these outsiders, agitators, and philosophical lucubrators in other fields is, well, rather larger than a 7-Up ad. But, Carlin, there's still time. You can still work in that direction for such a brief dramatization. In his book, Romano presents a broad and crowded stage where philosophizing circulates, often without the name. He offers fresh ideas, larger in fields of coverage, often juicier, or at least with theories less disciplined than those cultivated among their uptown cousins in professional philosophy. And some might judge that this philosophizing is simply nuttier, because not qualifying as true philosophy. To this, Romano argues that philosophy is most important for its work in the culture, rather than for its finer points of precision. To borrow some of Holder's words, just try making that kind of cultural impact from mainstream professional philosophy, and you won't get as far as you can with the unphilosophy that we have generally ignored or dismissed. Romano explains and justifies attention to the American unphilosophy with its flexible and practical thinking circulating in the academy and throughout the culture, especially in our time, but with precedence on the U.S. landscape and a pedigree in ancient Greece, no less, in the philosophy of Isocrates. I summarize this portion of my responses to Romano's ambitious and sprightly book by suggesting that he is offering a sturdy support for an understanding of philosophy as directional, and that this primal orienting task for the study of insight and wisdom is at least as important, albeit often for different purposes, as the task of achieving rigorous precision. I also add a warning and a suggestion. The warning is that his unphilosophy circulates unabashedly in the marketplace. And that setting offers rewards, yes, but it can exact a price. And my suggestion then also is for some more attention to points of linkage with the work and the example of William James, whose own directional and often quite precise philosophizing can offer support for Romano's unphilosophy. So my first area, unphilosophy, I call it, a new name for some new ways of thinking, but ways of philosophizing nonetheless with abundant precedents, some quite old. Romano sets his America, the philosophical, deep in the American grain. Before their philosophical expression, these ways of thinking had been predominant cultural traits. Americans are, at least in the mainstream, are impatient with authority, more flexible than rule-bound, tolerant of differences, and ready to ignore contradictions, avoid debates over fundamentals, and shun dogmatic arguments. While Romano readily recognizes exceptions to these traits, which have included adherence to constitutional rules, abundant examples of intolerance, and deep values debates, he is providing some patterns that have provided a template for thinking that has been fairly common in the U.S. Freedom of speech and general tolerance have meant that there is a wide acceptance of critical views, at least as measured by the relative lack of political violence. Members of defeated parties are not banished, imprisoned, or killed. The very lack of overt warfare, ideologically, may actually be a spur to culture warfare that we've witnessed in our time especially. That conflict, even when intensely polarized, is generally safe from violence. Romano detects this philosophizing without the name appearing in social commentaries, as well as in philosophy with strong social concerns, and among philosophers ready to use their wares for purposes outside of philosophy. Social and political philosopher Lucius Outlaw offers a representative example of what Romano is getting at here. He grew up African American and poor in the Deep South. During the 1960s and 70s, family and friends found his interest in philosophy puzzling. But then Outlaw himself found the mainstream analytical philosophy abstract and disconnected from the very concerns that drove him to philosophical inquiry. Folks are trying to figure out how to stop a war, he said. People are trying to figure out how to get racial justice. I didn't come out of Mississippi to analyze sentences. Outlaw represents the unphilosophy that Romano detects, even in the academy, as many philosophy professors use their inquiring minds to diagnose social ills and wake students and readers alike on ways to deal with them. While this and more examples of Romano's unphilosophical philosophizing still remain within the academy, he offers still more dramatic applications of America the philosophical. It is a strain of thinking suited to our times, when more people are not only thinking without philosophical language, but also thinking without books. Cyber-libertarian John Perry Barlow does not miss the sustained explanations of books, since they are more important as symbols of a line of thought, he said, really just totemic objects that people wave at one another. His enthusiasm for the liberating power of the web is matched by an array of cyber critics who predict losses of freedom, increased security measures, and reduced employment opportunities. Cyber debates like this often take place outside of academic philosophy. These recent trends show that Romano's unphilosophy is not so much non-philosophical, but a particular type of philosophy. One name for it is pragmatism. John Dewey offered a bridge from the academy to the public in presenting philosophy, as he put it, as a method cultivated by philosophers for dealing with problems of all citizens. Romano's unphilosophical philosophy has a still deeper history in the emphasis on rhetoric in ancient philosophy generally, and in the thought of the Greek Isocrates in particular, who advocated philosophical reasoning that involved public testing of ideas, expertise in discourse, and knowledge of culture. Ancient Greece was also home to a very different philosophical tradition, whose major figure, Socrates, emphasized the centrality of foundations. Then, through Plato, this philosophy became normative in the Western world, with its emphasis on epistemology and expectations for finding certainty, and with its depictions of rhetoric as merely a poor form of such knowledge, or worse, a form of trickery or an art of deception. Romano presents bookends, in effect, bookends around the rise of Western philosophy. In 4th century BCE Greece, the philosophical basis of the Western tradition, in competition with rhetoricians and others, was just starting to gel. Romano detects a parallel historical moment today, with competing visions of philosophical ways of thinking now veering away from Western foundational assumptions. Isocrates, Romano suggests, is newly relevant for our times. Pragmatists, from Charles Peirce to Richard Rorty, as with Jürgen Habermas, agree with Isocrates in some basic principles that Romano emphasizes in this tenor of his thought. Right answers emerge from public deliberation. Truth emerges from consensus, from decisions as much as from discovery. Judgment trumps acquisition of knowledge. And now to my second point. I call it a warning. Engage with the market, but be wary. Romano finds not only philosophers thinking outside the box of professional convention, but also philosophy in surprising places, including popular culture and on the web, with expressions ranging from the flippant to the earnest. The range of styles contributes to his point. Many different vehicles can convey directional insight. The founding editor of Wired, Kevin Kelly, advocates that philosophical hypotheses should be tested the way companies test products. This model for evaluation, along with the public appeal of many of Romano's figures, show the depths of this unphilosophy's immersion in the market, and it shares traits with markets. Consider these: flexibility, openness to change, resistance to absolutes, and popularity. That's marketplace thinking, but it's also unphilosophical thinking. A theory with wide accessibility is, in effect, one that has potential to grasp wide market share. Popularity is marketplace success, and its appeal to large numbers tends to hive off other measures of success, or even any other kind of quality. The favor of an audience itself can become the measure of quality, which can readily trump the qualities of precision and rigor, but also other important philosophical qualities, up to and including beauty, goodness, and even truth. So thinking in tune with the market can involve turning theories into commodities. As almost any teacher knows, the need to adapt sophisticated theories into lesson plans can involve truncated explanations and appeals to audience interests rather than unalloyed pursuit of rigor or truth. Students often add another layer of to unphilosophy. And yet there are upsides to precision. Formal philosophers with precise attention to fine points can appear irrelevant to a public audience, but those same mental skills can also be directed towards speaking truth to power. With relentless inquiry for exposure of self-serving rationalization and injustices, precision can be a counterpoint to marketplace appeal. And now my third point, some suggestions. Philosophizing in the key of William James, I call it. Romano characterizes America the Philosophical as a place where the battle between dogma and doggedness in seeking answers never ends. It's a marvelous phrase. I suggest another, with also an alliteration, for depicting American culture as a place where the tension between definiteness and desire about experience never ends. This captures Romano's detection of appetite in America the Philosophical, with desire driving the hunger for change, even as many still find change distasteful, and with desire driving the swerves of flexibility and contingency to the unphilosophies he depicts. And there is a very deep philosophical reason why the type of philosophizing that happens outside of formal channels. While mainstream Western philosophy has operated comfortably with dualisms of mind and body and other ways of segregating pairs of material and immaterial dimensions of life, the characters living and thinking with America the Philosophical are not so readily divided. This is a philosophical turf open to philosophizing that includes not just rational discourse, but also intuition, subjectivities, sentiments, tastes, desires, and other reasons of the heart, in Blaise Pascal's words. Many unphilosophers under Romano's purview consider these dimensions a part of thought rather than just thought on holiday or corruptions of true philosophy. America the Philosophical suggests a mingling of dual contrasts. William James observed that there are many different philosophical positions, each sound and coherent in itself, but each also in sharp contrast with other philosophies. Admirable, even extraordinary philosophical theories, full of deep knowledge, sophisticated reasoning, and precise expressions, confront contrasting theories of similar stature, which rest on strikingly different assumptions, each with its own inward character of thought, as he put it, never verified and often difficult to express, which provide the subjective marks that make each philosophy seem to be a rational conception from that person's point of view. Each sentiment of rationality then serves as the starting point for theorizing in that domain. Since the time of Plato's public relations triumph, formal philosophy has often held sentiments at bay, generally labeling them unphilosophical. The work that Romano cites display striking contrast with this tradition in philosophy, and James's ideas offer still more philosophical weight to the unphilosophical traditions that Romano examines. James also welcomed a marketplace of thinking, for example, in the varieties of religious experience, about a large array of religions to be taken seriously, just as Romano calls for us to take seriously the vast amount of philosophizing happening by other names. But James did not just welcome the array uncritically, he also urged consideration of the gravity of the positions being expressed. He judged that authentic religions say hush to all vain chatter and smart wit. I suggest that this means not just seriousness in character, but also the possibility for direction through the thickets of choices that modern culture, with its surging markets of ideas, provides. James offers a distinction that partakes of the advice in the very epigraph quotation that Romano uses to guide his own book, with James urging that our judgments should be right and not just observe a logical etiquette. In the 1875 book review, where James wrote these words, he anticipates the sentiment of rationality in 1879 in saying there is vital heat, a brute blind element in every thought before being reflected on. These sentiments support judgments he calls the great asset of human reasoning, the power to sort through a vast amount of information with identification of the parts most significant for the purpose at hand. He explains in his Principles of Psychology a few years later, in reasoning, we pick out essential qualities. Compared to philosophies of precision, this suggestion for direction is based on sound judgment. What it loses in data-driven or formal exactitude, it gains an ability to focus with deliberate purpose, based on sound reasoning, whose qualities need constant vetting by peers and critics. With this, James's ideas coincide with the thinking of fellow pragmatist Peirce in calling for communities of inquiry to correct our theories on the path toward ever truer understanding. This orientation does not support reason in contrast with the sentiments of the heart, but provides a portrait of reason inflected with those sentiments. This form of reasoning has ability to sort through a vast array of facts in discernment of the key ones for particular purposes, a trait that geniuses possess to an extreme degree, as James put it. So, if America is to be not only the philosophical, but the effectively philosophical, even if not always the genius philosophical, we need to be aware not only of the abundant sources of creative ideas, but also of keen, sensitive, creative, and sometimes even grave ways of deciding how to choose among them. America the philosophical has potential not just to identify the philosophy that Americans have been thinking all along without the name, but also to encourage more such thoughtful sorting of cultural direction. Even without a Jeffrey Holder-style ad, Romano's approach has potential to reach a popular audience for philosophical thinking, and some so reached may even become convinced to become philosophers of precision themselves. While watching his path of outreach, of philosophizing for direction, I hope practitioners of America the philosophical can heed the advice of William James and kindred philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. To paraphrase their ideas, seek a broader audience, seek a larger market share, and distrust it. Sally forth, Professor Romano, and keep doing good work. Thank you.
So, yeah, we've used up some of our time for comments, but I'd like to give you a chance to make a few comments, and maybe you can save some more for afterwards, and we can just do a huge comment afterwards.
So I guess the first thing I would say is that noting the old 7-Up commercials, I still, I guess, bristle a little bit at the unphilosophical. And it's something I'll mention in regard to John's comments too, that one of the things I'm trying to do is save the word philosophical for a much broader activity. I don't want to surrender without a shot, to the discipline. And there's another sort of technical problem in that in my introduction, as I try to get the idea of America, the philosophical, up off the ground, I very sedulously go back and forth between what I call America the unphilosophical and America the philosophical, and put forth a lot of evidence for why people might think, no, this is a Dumbo culture, right? So those two things might get confused, your sense of unphilosophical and the one I'm using in the introduction. So I'm most interested in keeping the word philosophy alive for the kinds of activities that I'm talking about. And I think you recognize this too in some of the initial comments I had from you at one point. I saw that you wrote that the kinds of ways of thinking that I'm describing, quote, are not so much non-philosophical as alternative ways to be philosophical. That's what you mean.
That's the meaning.
Right, yeah. And so I just, I would just raise for you whether the unphilosophical trope actually accomplishes that or somehow has a ring that again makes people think this is not philosophical. So that's one observation. With directional understanding and also precise answers, I'm very much a lover of precision where it's appropriate. And I remember, that old, Aristotelian, principle that, precision is fine when it's appropriate and it's not fine when it's not appropriate. So I often, I teach a course, Philosophical Problems of Journalism, in which I often, say to the students who are a mix of journalism students and philosophy students, how the hell do we put out a newspaper every day if nothing is clear, there are no facts, everything's up for grabs? And in fact, that's not true. And there's a lot of precise information, and there's a lot of confidence in that information, and that's why we can get out the Daily Miracle, as it's called in the business. So I just want to make clear that while I often quote that Wittgensteinian, motif that a blurred concept is still a concept, there are a lot of things that are not blurred, and I'm all for precision in the right place. And I guess the last comment I'd make, to keep it brief, is this notion of the danger of the market for philosophy. I don't find the market dangerous for philosophy. I'll come back to that same class. When people come to that class of mine, often the presumption is that it's going to be a class in which the philosophers tell the journalists how to think and what's right. And they're often surprised when I say, no, philosophers have a lot to learn from journalists about how fact is established, what's objective, and so on. So in the same way, I'm a kind of old John Stuart Millian. I think the market, when properly understood and also looked at skeptically, only increases the ability, to establish truth. I don't think that you have to descend in any way from your own standards and principles when you're dealing with market forces. And when the conversation opens up, if we think of, say, the present presidential campaign as a sort of market in which lots of notions are being discussed, but a lot of people think discourse is being dumbed down, I think we can address that topic, because I think this will come up in some of the other comments. Have things changed a lot from my age of Obama to what looks like the age of Trump? I don't think so. I think a lot of interesting philosophical things are getting in the air.
All right, thank you very much. So we're going to move on to our next speaker, and on my list that will be Jacquelyn. You have 15 minutes, and that will allow more discussion. If you go over a little bit, it'll just be our author.
Carlin Romano claims, contrary to some critics, that America is not an America of unreason, not idiot America. Rather, America is the most philosophical culture in the history of the world, an unprecedented marketplace of truth and argument. This, he says, however, is not due to academic philosophy, which has failed miserably by narrowing the philosophical vision and abandoning its public role. Philosophy as a discipline in general has lost relevance and become marginal to the genuine philosophical concern of the marketplace of ideas. Romano then draws on a wide spectrum of persons outside of academic philosophy as models for how philosophy should be done, claiming that these persons engage in forms of persuasion, argument, and debate. These include psychologists, literary critics, political theorists, linguists, mathematicians, one of my favorites, neurologist Oliver Sacks, and he cites casual wise men such as Hugh Hefner, print journalists, broadcasters, and others. I, for one, have admired the wisdom put forth by many of these figures. I use the work of Oliver Sacks in several of my courses on person and self and mind. George Fletcher's book on loyalty is parallel to the philosophy of loyalty written by American philosopher Josiah Royce. However, I am a little puzzled by what seems a series of portraits and reviews of these persons, but no clear connection to each other, or I don't find any clear criteria that makes the work of these individuals philosophical, although Paul has suggested that there are unphilosophical and other ways of doing philosophy. What is Romano's intent in bringing in all these individuals? I certainly applaud Romano for arguing that philosophy today needs to be more inclusive. He has a section of his book entitled Rising Outsiders. This section focuses on African Americans, women, Native Americans, and gays. However, setting these individuals aside under this title, outsiders, suggests that they are somehow newcomers to philosophy. Of course, they are in the sense that these groups have not been allowed to have a strong presence at the APA, although this is changing. However, I think it's more appropriate to say of this group what he does say in his introduction, namely, American the Philosophical always included African American philosophers. The section on African Americans is very powerful, and I appreciate it very much. Romano's discussion of women in philosophy I find less satisfactory. He begins his discussion of women philosophers with the Neoplatonic thinker Hypatia, arguing that knowing the historical facts about women in philosophy remains challenging. He does give credit to Nancy Tuano for her feminist interpretations of great philosophers. He recounts the shoddy, extremely biased account of Margaret Fuller by Pulitzer Prize historian V.I. Parrington, and also the somewhat complex treatment of Jane Addams. Charlene Siegfried, with her book Pragmatism and Feminism, is credited with establishing Addams as a pragmatist philosopher who made substantial contribution to the initial formulation of this movement. However, I believe Romano falls back into a slightly disparaging mode when he writes, quote, "Today, philosophers increasingly recognize that persuasive storytelling, the genre in which Adams and Coles excel, may count as effective philosophical argument. This ignores the fact that pragmatists, including Adams, engaged in very effective argumentation, while they also argued for situation knowledge in the stories and the marginalized as a reliable basis for research and for public recommendations and action. I, like several other reviewers, do not know what to make of the Hannah Arendt section, which focuses on her relationship with Heidegger more than on an explanation of why she fits into America as philosophical. The dismissal of Martha Nussbaum as too professorial, I believe, ignores the substantial contribution she has made to social and political philosophy and philosophy in general. I especially appreciated the section on African American women philosophers, the colloquium of Black women philosophers, and Anita Allen. The section on Native American philosophy and gays is a bit sparse, partly because so little attention has been paid to these issues by the philosophical establishment. I recall well the Albuquerque meeting of the APA and the unprecedented 5 sessions on American Indian philosophy. It would have been helpful for me if Romano had spoke more of current developments in this area. I also would ask Romano to relate his project to the following comments of Viola Cardova, who says, quote, "Native Americans should play the role of questioning those who are never questioned. They should be disturbers of the peace," end quote. This, I believe, is a central role of philosophy in general. Cordova also warned against the creation of another ethno-philosophy, another campus ghetto in philosophy. She insists that Native American thinkers should grapple with the Euro-American tradition's unexamined assumptions. Does Romano agree? Is this why he brings outsiders into the America of the philosophical? And why does he ignore the increasing inclusion of Mexican and Latin American philosophy into the philosophical dialogue? Again, however, I applaud Carlin for his plea to philosophy to become more public and inclusive. Romano is correct, and Paul has already said that the pragmatic tradition holds the key to re-envisioning the nature and role of philosophy, both in its academic and public role. One of the problems of mainstream contemporary philosophy in America is it either has ignored its history or misinterprets the idea of the classical pragmatism. Thus, John Dewey and Josiah Royce both criticize academic philosophy for its inner focus on problems of knowledge rather than on the practical problems of contemporary life. Charles Sanders Peirce criticized the Cartesian paradigm, as did others pragmatists, one that still dominates philosophy today as well as other disciplines. And he and Royce presented a view of science unlike today's scientism, which exalts so-called scientific truths above any others. These classical pragmatists view science as the ideal community of critical inquiry, and the scientific process is self-correcting, based on reasonable doubt, problem solving, and recognizing that there is no possibility at any time of one's beliefs gaining warranted certainty. Rather, these beliefs, whether about physics, biology, or in some other domain, were always fallible. This view of science is probably that of most practicing scientists. It is the philosophers and even the general public that have come to hold science as the final arbiter of truth. One role that philosophers need to play today in America is to educate both the public and philosophy about scientific knowledge and about its reliable but fallible nature. Romano holds Richard Rorty up as one model of philosophy, and I'm not going to say much about this since we have an expert on that, but I have concerns, and I know that Richard probably changed his view, about Rorty's emphasis on free-flowing conversation, a conversation that is individual and private and not focused on public issues, debate, or argument. In contrast, Dewey, Peirce, and Royce saw critical inquiry, not conversation, as an essential element in the responsible philosophical response to human problems. And they, not ignoring the role of the individual, viewed community as an essential part of such inquiry, contributing significantly to the self-correcting aspect of such a process, as it does in science. Dewey and Royce both criticized the strong individualistic bent of American life. I want to use, as Paul did, William James as a classic model of what American philosophy should be about. And I'm referring back to Josiah Royce's memorial piece on William James, in which he described him as the classical American philosopher. And in that essay, he cites three characteristics of James, which makes him the ideal American representative philosopher. The first the characteristics that he cites, I believe, are very relevant today and to philosophy. James, he says, is one who gives utterance to philosophical ideas which are characteristic of some stage and some aspect of life of his or her own people. In Royce's view, James addressed three main areas crucial to his time. The first was evolutionary thought. All four classical pragmatists, Peirce, James, Dewey, and Royce, took evolutionary thought seriously in forming their own views and contributed to the application of evolutionary ideas to other areas of thought and practice. Today, there is also strong focus on evolutionary thought and its wide-ranging applicability for explaining many areas of life and thought. Unfortunately, many contemporary philosophers have reverted to an earlier period, already transcended by the classical pragmatists. Namely, they have become a group. They do not engage in true criticism of evolutionary ideas. Rather, there is a group of scholastic-type philosophers who wish to defend and exalt scientific views as authoritative for all areas of life, while dogmatic religionists assert the priority of religious truth and focus. The representative philosophers today needs to engage in interpreting the implications of evolutionary thought for human living, while also promoting a sense of humility about science as a valuable area of critical but self-correcting inquiry. Royce suggests a second characteristic of James in responding to his time. Namely, he was concerned with the age of occupation of new territory, economic growth, immigration, and the aftermath of the Civil War. Royce notes that the nation was, quote, attempting to find itself anew, to redefine its ideals, to retain its moral integrity, and yet to become a world power, end quote. This bears some striking similarities to the status of the United States today. Though we are a world power, we seem to be struggling to redefine what that means. In addition, we are facing an immigration crisis that demands solution. And though we are no longer in a state of civil war, we as a nation have been involved in the civil wars of others, attempting to advocate human rights and democracy. These efforts have left us viewed with suspicion by many other nations and raised serious questions for many members of the U.S. public. We need to return to the view of the pragmatists that democracy is more than a particular form of government. It is a way of living. Philosophers should be using their intellectual resources to advocate this view and facilitate democratic, fruitful discussion among the public. America truly needs to be an agora, a field of democratic debate and deliberation, but carried on in a manner of civility and respect, unlike the political scene today. A final aspect of Royce's classification of James as a representative American philosopher is that he gave utterance to the spiritual life of his people. Royce says of James's the variety of religious experience, quote, it expresses better than any sectarian could the recent efforts of this spirit to come to an understanding with modern naturalism and with modern psychology. Further, James's view of religious experience, like those of other pragmatists, is deliberately unconventional and intensely democratic. This is significant today because his contemporary philosophy, as Judith Green has asserted, is tone deaf to religious experience. Yet there is no doubt that religion plays a crucial role in our time in various ways, whether it be a more sectarian or authoritarian view represented in Christian and Islamic fundamentalism, or the views of Eastern religions, or the commitment of many intelligent, thoughtful people to some kind of religious experience, in contrast to religious doctrine or membership. To speak to contemporary Americans, this tone deafness to religion is a distinct liability. In addition, it betrays an ignorance of the history of American philosophy, a history that included a variety of reflections in religious experience from the very beginning, okay? One cannot speak of a philosophical America without exploring the meaning of the phrase America. Romano does this through an exploration of the views of two leading political theorists, Rawls and Walzer. Romano criticizes Rawls for his emphasis on philosophical justification, his image as, quote, the ultimate argument machine and grand systematizer. He also criticizes his distance from popular culture. I believe Rawls' flaw is not this, but his adoption of the Enlightenment view of the human person as the rational individual chooser, ignoring, as the classical pragmatists did not, the essential role of emotions and other factors in decision-making and deliberation. As the agonists and other feminist philosophers have argued, the nature of politics in a pluralistic democracy is inherently conflictual with battles over power hegemony between the central tasks of democratic struggle. For this group, the major question any political theory must address is how should we deal with irreducible difference. They also ask how we can design a democracy so as to optimize the opportunity for people to express their disagreement. Romano cites, as we all have said, other model of philosophy, I-Socrates, rather than Socrates. Scholars of I-Socrates argue that he is not a sophist, but he demands reflection and deliberative choice, not unthinking response. Romano is correct that this attitude seems that of pragmatism in its emphasis upon critical problem solving. However, Socrates also represents critical dialogue and problem solving. It was Plato who was the foundationalist. Greek liberalism, unlike that of Rawls and other contemporary political theorists, was fundamentally communal and rhetoric. The art of persuasion was central to the polis. This fits with the emphasis by the pragmatist on continual, communal, critical inquiry. And this is what the American philosophical model ought to be today.
Thank you. That was really excellent. We're going to have a little bit of time here for Carlin, I think, and maybe that might be all we have time for, but we'll see. If we have a couple more minutes, we'll open it up.
I really owe Jacquelyn fantastic thanks because you've done yeoman's work. She has done a paper for an upcoming symposium of transactions of the Charles Peirce Society on my book and a separate piece for this. So I really, really thank you for the hard work you've done. And I'd read the longer version of what Jackie wrote for this, so I'm going to shoot very quickly through some of the points, try to keep it fairly short. I'm very happy that Jackie appreciates the inclusiveness of the book. I do want to say about the idea of women or African Americans as newcomers, that I very much didn't think of them as newcomers, as I think you acknowledged. That's why I use the phrase rising outsiders. I was trying to make a point about their acknowledgement by the establishment of the profession in recent times. And going back to Hypatia was meant to be a little bit jokey, like I'm really going to start at the beginning. The connection often, to address the issue of connection, the connection often between the people in the book is really simplistic and journalistic. In many cases, it's who I was able to manage to write about, because I couldn't write about everybody, given the size of the book, 672 pages anyway. So there are many things that might well be in the book. And of course, many critics have said there are things in the book that should not be in the book, like Ayn Rand or Hugh Hefner. So we can talk about that afterwards. Let me come to some other points. When you mentioned that my discussion of women philosophers is less satisfactory, and I want to say that I did not mean at all to be in a disparaging mode with Jane Addams. Quite the contrary. I just want to note that among the things I said in that section is that I quote Westbrook, a great scholar on Dewey. It is difficult to say whether Dewey influenced Jane Addams or Jane Addams influenced Dewey. I referred to the, quote, supposed paucity of her theoretical texts, by which I meant to indicate that there are those theoretical texts and that she does argue, and University of Illinois Press has done a great job of bringing a lot of those back into print. And then I mentioned the great Charlotte Siegfried's tipping of the hat, crediting Addams with an original contribution to the formulation of pragmatism. So I'm sorry if it came off that way, but I very much honor her as an arguer also. I think I was just trying to emphasize the point that she did philosophy in a different mode also, aside from that. With Hannah Arendt, part of what I was trying to do with a lot of the people in the book was to show them as flesh and blood human beings. And this is an aspect that philosophers and journalists disagree about. A lot of philosophers think the moment you mention a philosopher, you have some kind of obligation to exposit their whole philosophy, which is not really possible, and often you're mentioning them as an example of something. So with Arendt, I wasn't going to get into totalitarianism and so on, or the banality of evil. I was trying to say something about her career through that very controversial relationship with Heidegger. Similarly, with Nussbaum, and I've had this discussion with her, when I say she's too professorial, I was trying to make the point that it doesn't matter if you have, 40 honorary PhDs when it comes to having an influence on the public intellectual marketplace. I think she has been too professorial in her style. I shall make 75 arguments on this side and 45 arguments on that side, and writing often in a pedestrian academic style when she is quite capable of being lively and funny. And I think there's always been some kind of commitment to being a proper academic on her part and a proper part of the establishment in philosophy that has kept her from writing more flamboyantly, more entertainingly. So I do respect her work very much, but I was kind of commenting as a media critic on why her influence is somewhat restricted. Again, I did have to make a decision. What did I mean by America? And I very much meant the United States. United States, the philosophical does not ring, right? I was playing off the song and many previous plays off the song. I do think Mexican-American philosophy is important and belongs in the book. I just couldn't get to it. Same thing with Hmong philosophy, with Chinese philosophy. I subsequently wrote a big piece about the rise of Chinese philosophy in the United States, and if there's ever another edition of the book, I would try to fold that in. But that was really a case of my not being able to get to things. I had a couple of reviews that said, oh, your Native American chapter is very slight, to which my reaction was, compared to what? Most people don't even pay any attention. So that, again, was just a size matter, and I wasn't trying to place Native American philosophy in a ghetto. I agree with you. Scott Pratt's book on Native pragmatism is wonderful. But I would say that a lot of the Native American philosophers at that Albuquerque meeting that we were both at very much themselves wanted to define, it seemed to me, a Native American tradition as a special tradition. So I think that has to be a continuing argument. Bruce Wilshire also did interesting work about the connection between classical pragmatism and Native American thought. Just a couple of quick things. I very much respect your fine sense of etiquette with Mary sitting here and not spending much time on Dick and his thinking as you did in the written version. But I think this is a rare opportunity, having Mary here, to talk about possibly some misunderstandings, I think, of Dick's position. So, in your written version, and we have to thank the Jasper Society. It's wonderful that you tape these things, so we will live forever as long as the internet's there. And we will do written versions. So this is for you people coming to this, over the internet. Look at the written versions. That will be very specific. The claim is made that by many people, not just you, that Dick thought there was this separate area of individual self-creation and a separate area of social commitment and attendance to community and so on. And I think that's completely false. I mean, in my knowledge of him, Mary, of course, certainly transcends my knowledge, but I was his research assistant as an undergraduate. I knew him for a long time. I read basically everything. I think he felt those two areas of life fed each other, fueled each other, and that you could look at them both individually, but in an actual human person, they go together and they provoke each side. And I think books of his, like Achieving Our Country, showed that. So I hope we could talk about that a little bit. Lastly, I very much agree with your belief that evolutionary thought matters today. I agree with you in your written comments that the cognitive and emotional must be thought about together. I very much agree with the way you bring Royce and James in. But two very last things, the importance of religion. You write, to be tone deaf to religious experience and practice is to be tone deaf to the problems of contemporary America. I would edit that. I would say you cannot be deaf to religion. but there might be an argument to be tone deaf to religion. In this sense, right? That, I mean, if we're going to be critical of religion and if we're not going to automatically buy its claims, I'm very much unlike my old friend Hitchens and Dawkins and so on. I believe in dialogue. I was a Templeton Fellow in philosophy and religion, but I don't believe that means that you are obligated to any sort of reverent tone or overly respectful tone if you feel that certain claims cannot be supported. So I'm very much for openness in hearing, but tone deaf suggests a little bit to me that you might have to be more polite than is warranted in a secular religious discussion. Finally, the Socrates problem you raise is a very important one, but it's the old problem, Plato-Socrates versus who the historical figure was, the Socrates of the early dialogues versus the Socrates of the later dialogues. And so for my purposes, vis-a-vis Isocrates, I wanted to emphasize the Socrates of the later dialogues who I think believes there's an answer at the end of the road. Thanks.
Okay, again, we're going to save extraneous comments to the end, so keep your questions. We're right on time if we move on to John, who's going to give his critique next.
So I'd like to thank Carlin for this invitation. It was nice to read the book again. My comments are split into two parts, a sort of philosophical argument and then a few general comments about trade publishing and philosophy. So Carlin Romano is not a philosopher, but neither were most of the writers who make up but neither were most of the writers who make up the canon of classical American philosophy. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the founder of the American Scholar, of what Oliver Wendell Holmes calls our intellectual declaration of independence, was not a philosopher. I think that philosophy is rude and elementary, Emerson writes. Philosophy will one day be taught by poets. Henry David Thoreau wrote popular, and I mean popular, books, and never held a professorship. Neither did C.S. Peirce, for that matter, and he too made a living on his popular writings, not his seminal work of American pragmatism. William James, the American philosopher, hated philosophy. I mean, really. Quote, "I am unfit to be a philosopher," unquote, James wrote, because, quote, "at bottom, I hate philosophy, especially at the beginning of a vacation," unquote. Richard Rorty, forget it. The American intellectual canon was, and hopefully still is, premised on its rejection of philosophy, or at least a certain strain of it. Romano's America the Philosophical is written in the spirit of this tradition, and he takes an almost sadistic glee in avoiding the, quote, 11,000-member black hole in American media and public life, unquote, that he calls the profession of philosophy. Romano objects to contemporary analytic philosophy's penchant for logic crunching, its inability to see the forest of everyday life for the trees of philosophical analysis. But the self-sabotage of 20th century philosophy, according to Romano, was long in the making. In the Enlightenment's obsession with objective truth and abstract ideals, philosophy relinquished its claim to practical relevance. Before this, the legacy of Platonism that dominated late ancient and medieval thought set the stage for what the American pragmatist John Dewey would later call the philosopher's fallacy, in replacing the intricate details of the real world for the broad strokes of abstract theorizing. So there was much for William James to hate about this supposed love of wisdom. 4 years ago, when Romano's book first came out, its honesty and accuracy struck a nerve. Most mainstream contemporary philosophers hated the book. In indignation, I suspect, born at least in part of defensiveness and sour grapes. Their indignation, however, sometimes overlooked the positive program that Romano was proposing. He argued that despite the need to overcome and perhaps dismantle the nomen of philosophy, there is something that is worth preserving in this tradition, namely the legacy of the 4th century rhetorician Isocrates. Isocrates was one of the first to deflate philosophy's grand metaphysical and epistemological claims. He was a sophist, yes, but a certain kind, one who was a keen observer of present political and cultural circumstances, and who was able to analyze and negotiate them with reason, feeling, and imagination, in arriving at practical provisional judgments. He was, on Romano's reading, a proto-pragmatist, and it is his philosophy to which modern America is well fitted. Quote, America in the early 21st century, according to Romano, towers as the most philosophical culture in the history of the world, an unprecedented marketplace for truth. Despite agreeing with large swaths of the book, I'm afraid that this proclamation was somewhat premature. America the Philosophical was written in the age of Obama, and we are now, even if he loses, in the age of Trump. And I worry that America runs the very real risk of taking or extending an unphilosophical turn. It is a time when we might, understandably, be wary of sophistry. This being said, Romano picked his particular sophist carefully. In the late 4th century BCE, Isocrates composed a series of arguments that have come to be known as against sophistry. That's right, against sophistry. Romano seems aware of this piece and uses it to frame the argument against philosophy, contemporary philosophy as a whole. In Against Sophistry, Isocrates outlines the guiding principles of the true rhetorician: originality, timeliness, and appropriateness, or the fittedness of a response to a given situation. According to Romano, this is what the history of philosophy, and particularly the recent history of analytic philosophy, lacks. There is more than something to this. Much of contemporary philosophy is largely derivative, and in some cases unknowingly derivative, which is to say, redundant. It fails to address present political and cultural concerns, and it often provides theories that are ill-fitted to the realities of individuals and their communities. This is changing, but not fast enough. But something continues to trouble me in this framing of Isocrates. The bit of fame that the Greek does enjoy is not traced to his arguments in Against Sophistry, but to his role in teaching two very famous, some might say infamous, individuals, Glaucon and Thrasymachus, figures that get immortalized in Plato's Republic. I know that Romano has a problem with Platonism, and a well-founded one, but I have a problem with Isocrates' students. So perhaps we need to thread this needle pretty carefully. In Book 2 of the Republic, Glaucon offers what I take to be one of the central challenges to morality in the form of the myth of Gyges, the Turkish farmer who uses a magic ring, Frodo style, to sneak into a palace, seduce a queen, kill a king, and take over the land and become incredibly rich. When I tell my students this story, most of them are horrified, but some have a different reaction: admiration bordering on adulation. Gyges is so smart, they say, so original. He knows just the right time to strike. He knows exactly how to negotiate the situation. What a genius. It's almost like he read Against Sophistry. Socrates spends the rest of the Republic trying to convince his listeners that Gyges is, in fact, a moral monster. And he generally convinces me, but some of my students never buy it. The same students who I fear are voting for Donald Trump. They're the ones who admire Gyges. They also don't object to Thrasymachus, Isocrates' other famous student, who is less circumspect than Glaucon in presenting the moral stance that might follow from a certain sophistical teaching. Justice is serving the interest of the stronger. America may have been based on open discourse and rational argumentation, as Romano often suggests, but it also incubated a form of political and ideological exceptionalism that seems to fit Thrasymachus quite nicely. Justice is what works for the stronger. Manifest destiny, gunboat diplomacy, 20th century realpolitik, the policy of build a wall, build it taller, all of these fit very nicely with the might makes right attitude expressed by Isocrates' students. So how might Isocrates or Romano respond to this sort of criticism? I think it has to turn on a passing remark, a very important one, made in the closing pages of America the Philosophical. Quote, "Unlike the sophists or rhetoricians targeted by Plato," Romano writes, "Isocrates throughout his work voices a moral sensibility. One can't guarantee honesty, but one can try, and philosophy is the best training for it," unquote. I would like Romano to comment on this moral sense. How minimal or robust does it need to be? At the beginning of Against Sophistry, at the end of Against Sophistry, Isocrates states that while no particular philosophy can adequately define the good, practicing rhetoric is the best propedeutic in cultivating virtue. Is this what Romano has in mind? If so, I'm on board, although I might make the point that this is not altogether different from Socrates of the early dialogues. So, for example, Socrates' refusal to give a general definition of piety in the Euthyphro, but his suggestion at many points that philosophy, the pursuit of the good, the true, the beautiful, the real, is the proper way to spend one's life. Isocrates notes that this pursuit is always not quite, provisional, on the way, fallible. There's a sort of modesty to this Socratic project, one that attracted a number of classical American thinkers who Romano highlights in the book. Emerson's 1820 Bowdoin essay at Harvard, The Character of Socrates, keys in on this ongoing, authentic investigation that motivated much of ancient thought. And it was the pragmatist John Dewey who in the 1930s calls for what he calls the back to Plato movement. But to be clear, the Plato of the dialogues, the dramatic investigative Plato, not the Plato of the forms. Peirce and his idealist friend Josiah Royce held that leading ideas directed toward truth in the long run might help us avoid the dangers of sophistry. And James and Dewey both reflected ameliorism, the idea that progress is real and possible, a moral sensibility that run askance of Gyges. Why am I underscoring the similarity between a reading of Isocrates and Plato and the pragmatists? It isn't to reject Romano's thesis, but perhaps to temper it. We need to articulate a few ground rules that will keep Isocrates from traveling the path of Glaucon and Thrasymachus. Many of Romano's heroes, the American pragmatists, for example, were accused of opening the door to a vicious relativism. For much of the 20th century, pragmatism was described by many critics as a crass instrumentalism, as an anything-goes conception of philosophy that was so inclusive, so freewheeling, that it lost its grip on reasonable discourse. When Romano's book came out, many admired it, but some critics voiced similar concerns about its pragmatic appeal. For example, when Romano and Jason Stanley came to heads at a conference at Harvard in 2011, it was not pretty. Stanley went after Romano for not appreciating the value of technical argumentation in supporting particular ideals and beliefs. Stanley's implication at the time was pretty clear. Average folk should leave philosophizing to real philosophers. Romano, completely exasperated with the heights of intellectual bloom flying, mounted a counterattack. Nancy Bauer, in her recent and extremely good book called How to Do Things with Pornography, outlines the ensuing debate between Stanley and Romano and makes a suggestion that might mediate the divide between Romano's Isocratic philosophy and Stanley's analytic approach. Bauer points us back to a certain reading of Plato, writing, quote, "Any philosopher worthy of the name was obligated not just to commune with the forms, but to come down from the mountaintop and to attempt to attract the citizenry to the sublime, if almost imperceptible, beauty of reason," unquote. I think that this is the best way to interpret America Philosophical, and oddly enough, Stanley's popular writings after the 2011 argument. They are at their best when they are inviting us to experience the beauty of reason. And now just a few very general comments. A word about philosophical trade publishing. It is hard. First, you have to convince an agent that you can write, really write, and then you have to convince a large publisher like Knopf that your book will actually sell. This means reaching an audience that many philosophers still regard as unreachable. Then you have to convince yourself that you can actually pull off this whole thing. You sex up your book, knowing full well that your academic reputation is on the line, and even if you ruin yourself in this respect, you know people will still not buy it. If they don't, your hopes of reaching a wider audience in the future are next to nil. As you write, you have to tread a fine line between intellectual integrity and accessibility, between content and voice. This is a line that few academics ever confront. Criticizing the philosophical on the merits of professional philosophy is relatively easy. It is not written for academic philosophers. It omits figures and topics that contemporary philosophers regard as matters of vital importance. But I think we are missing the point if we get stuck on this. Romano's book has a narrative, and this, in my very limited experience, is the only thing that sells a philosophical trade book. And the narrative necessarily narrows the scope of the project. Read Peter Godfrey Smith's book coming out with FSG next year. Peter is a serious philosopher, a philosopher's philosopher. But I bet there's a narrative to this book that dictates in some way the content of the manuscript. This is trade publishing. If you opt out, I think you have to be very careful about criticizing those who don't. Before you criticize Romano, try doing what he has done. A final comment about what I think Carlin is up to in this book. He is not presenting a comprehensive history of American philosophy. He is not explaining how classical American philosophy in all of its various forms fits with the broader historical canon. He is not particularly interested in sorting out disagreements within American philosophy, resolving, for example, the tension between Rorty scholars and classical pragmatists. I could be wrong, but he just doesn't care that much about this. No one, I hope, goes to this book hoping to satisfy traditional philosophical curiosity. Grad students will not read it in order to teach their seminar on Royce and Peirce. It's not going to happen. If they were, I'd be much more disturbed. This shouldn't come as any huge surprise. He tells us from the outset what he thinks of professional philosophy. I take him to be doing something a little different here. He is trying to develop an original philosophical thesis that will pique the interest of the widest possible audience. Those who know their Rorty and Dewey, but also those who have never heard of them. And we should be under no illusions. Rorty and Dewey are not household names. Romano has, quite admirably, tried to write a household book, one that has already served as a much-needed Trojan horse in a culture that has yet to make up its mind about whether to be philosophical. Thanks.
Okay, at this moment, we're doing pretty good on time, so let's give Carlin a full chance to rebut that.
So I want to point out to the millions viewing this video that John has killed about 5 of my markets there. In response, I want to say this is a comprehensive history of everything. It should be adopted for every course, including courses in French literature and Brazilian history, and so on and so forth. No, I'm especially grateful because I know John is, working the same territory I am now in sort of broader journalism and writing for a wider market, that he took the time to make some comments about the realities of writing for a broad intellectual public. 2 other quick things since they came up. I am hoping that Nancy Bauer's book, How to Do Things with Pornography, that the pornography is not a direct reference to my book. I was not aware that she is dealing with me at all and the Jason Stanley thing, so I'll have to go look at that. And I want to point out too that Jason and I ended up in rooms next to each other in a hotel at the World Congress of Philosophy, and so through the bridge of Yiddishkeit, we managed to be very friendly and have fun and all of that, even though we obviously don't agree on a lot of things. So, again, a quick run through of comments so we can then have a broader discussion. As a little bit with Paul, I would say, as we say in journalism, I'd kill your lead. That Romano is not a philosopher, not out of personal pique. I don't think you mean it disparagingly. I think you're trying to work out this sort of actually complementary conceit looking through Emerson and Thoreau. But again, I very much, and I think I differ a little bit from Dick in this, Dick Rorty at a certain point didn't really care about the word philosophy or being a philosophy professor and so on. And I remember, saying to him, but the word has a kind of prestige. And there's a usefulness to that prestige and the prestige of thinking broadly and widely and conceptually, and that, again, we shouldn't surrender that to the technicians and the specialists. So I still want to fight for the word philosophy as applying to Emerson and to Thoreau and to me and to a lot of these people in my book who are not philosophy professors. I guess I also want to say, in regard to Isocrates, this is a part of the book that I thought was probably the most original part of the book, because nobody really celebrates Isocrates except the classical scholars working on him. And I want to emphasize back to John that he was not a sophist, I think. And that he should not be regarded as a sophist. I'll just give you 2 quick examples from the book. I quote the very fine classical scholar Yun Li Tu, who wrote that he asserts his opposition to sophists, Isocrates, because, quote, the discourse of these individuals poses the greatest obstacle to achieving Greek unity and Athenian hegemony, for they engage in modes of writing, heuristic, paradox, logography, which bring no profit to their societies. Another scholar, John Polakos, wrote, Isocrates is anything but a sophist. He demands reflection and deliberative choice, not unthinking response. He's far from a nomadic intellectual. He is a sedentary, somewhat conservative citizen of democratic Athens. His conceptual scheme does not revolve around what is powerful, as did that of the sophists, whose experience was formed by the rise of tyrants," unquote. So I think, you engage a little bit in sort of blaming him for his students, and I think that's a dangerous move because, we can't take responsibility for our students. One of the philosophers, the Finnish philosopher Saarinen, who's contributing to this transactions thing, was stabbed in his chest by one of his students. And the students can do all sorts of crazy things and, like Thrasymachus, go off in a direction that the teacher would not like. So I think we should be careful about that. In John's, written remarks, he wrote, "My book is 4 years old, and so something has changed." I don't think anything has changed in the age of Trump, and I hope this won't be remembered as the age of Trump. But we're in the middle of the campaign. We don't know if he'll win or not. I would say this, and it's the same reaction I've had to many people when I was on my book tour and so on, saying, how can you make this claim, America the Philosophical? It's such a dumbed down culture. Look at what A is saying or B is saying. But my argument back is that often what these people are saying triggers much more sophisticated responses. So just take an example with Trump, who wants to deal with foreign policy as a businessman, right? So yeah, hey, Japan doesn't pay for nuclear protection, South Korea doesn't pay for nuclear protection, we'll pull out. This has triggered in the last week or two, I think, fascinating discussion about the concept of deterrence, and also the concept of applying business principles to foreign policy. I think his position is dopey and dangerous, just the way Obama does. But in fact, because he either thinks outside the box or thinks without a brain, however you want to, certainly without literacy in a lot of these subjects, it's like out of the mouth of babes. It opens up questions that everybody has considered settled. So, I think that it's not counterproductive to philosophy when you have a lot of dumb or uneducated or ignorant people saying things that force people back to their fundamental premises and force them to articulate, counter responses. And I want to say too, I very much appreciate, the points about trade publishing and the different things that you have to do there. You have to entertain, you have to grab attention, and so on. But I do think it's possible to do that without abandoning a certain form of philosophical, rigor. That's the real trick of it, trying to, through wordplay, through a lot of detail, factual information, touching base with traditional intellectuals and philosophers, communicate to the reader that you're trying to talk to everyone. You're trying to talk to the smartest and the most educated in philosophy, but also keeping a common touch. I agree with you. Very hard. I don't think I successfully do it everywhere, but I try to. I'll leave it there for now.
All right. Next on my list is Mary Rorty, and I'll give you your full time.
It's a pleasure and really an honor, I think, to be asked to participate in this session on Carlin's book, America the Philosophical. It gave me occasion to return to a book that I enjoyed thoroughly the first time through. I'm only sorry that Dick didn't survive to read it himself. I think he's the one that should be here this evening. He's the Rorty that should be here. As I understand Carlin's project, it's a pretty ambitious one. He paints a picture of American pragmatism, placing Rorty in a tradition, indeed, in some sense, it seems to me, as a paradigm in this book of that tradition, an example of what a really American philosopher could look like. It's a project of culture change through language, of persuasive, rational redescription. And that project implicates two things: a view of what characterizes being an American in his sense, and a vision of what it is to do philosophy. Undaunted, Carlin proceeds to spend 600 pages doing both. Ambitious? You bet. Controversial? I should hope so. What good's any project that even mentions Rorty unless it's controversial. I'll briefly mention several things about the book that particularly struck me. First, some comments on the Rorty chapter. Second, some thoughts provoked by the discussion of Isocrates. Third, a digression on style. And of course, fourth, the vexed question, what is philosophy anyway? Jackie, it's nice that you consider me an expert on Rorty. I have to say that I am a Rortian by marriage, but not probably by scholarship. But I was delighted not only by the chapter on Rorty, which featured one of the family's favorite pictures of Dick with his daughter, but by the placement of that chapter in the book and the recurrence throughout the book of the themes that he adumbrates in that chapter. Romano places Rorty where he would like to be placed, I think, as heir of and contributor to American pragmatism, and not just because of Rorty's admiration for John Dewey. Carlin has read a lot of Rorty and a lot about Rorty. I suspect if there's any expert in this room about Rorty, it's more likely to be Carlin than me. I proofread lots of the stuff, but I'm not sure that I've read as much of it as Carlin. That's very clear, I think, in his 30-page chapter entitled Rorty's Revolution. The book's an interpretation. It's a view of Rorty and his influence, but it's by no means a hagiography. In the chapter on Rorty, Carlin treats with the same care the critics as he treats the subject. He notices that lots of other scholars of pragmatists and of pragmatism refuse to recognize their chosen philosopher or their chosen movement in Rorty's descriptions. Of course, that's as it should be, right? That's what keeps us reading each other's work and writing papers and returning to our sources. Carlin notes as well Dick's rather generous inclination to drag into his particular tent of pragmatism many contemporaries who might have had little or no inclination to enter it voluntarily. He doesn't ignore the criticism of Rorty as a relativist, and I think he does a good job on that. And he's effusive in his praise of Mirror. And he dates Rorty's, what he calls his shooting star reputation, I think, to its publication in 1979. The reception of and the reaction to the book certainly set Dick on a particular course. My own impression at the time was that Richard himself was surprised, perhaps even puzzled, that the book was so controversial. Perhaps they misunderstand what I was trying to say, he might have thought. Maybe I can say it more clearly. So he kept trying to make himself more clearly understood. When Romano notes at the end of that chapter that Richard commented in the Schultz volume that Mirror might be out of date. Maybe what that happened was that in the 20 years since its publication, Rorty thought that maybe he'd finally got his message across. Or maybe instead, some of the rest of the world had caught up. My own philosophical preparation has been as a classical scholar. I wrote my Hopkins dissertation on Aristotle's theory of perception. So when I got to section 5 of Carlin's book, I was really delighted. We can't have too many Greek heroes. There's always room for one more. And who was this guy anyway? I mean, it's bad enough that when Rorty was a Chicago undergraduate, what's this, a 16-year-old? He wrote a paper on one Greek philosopher that I had never heard of. But now he's being compared to another Greek I'd never heard of. I trotted down to our Stanford garage and rooted through the 18 bookshelves of the Dick's library, or at least the small portion of it that he brought from Virginia. No Isocrates. But what I enjoyed most about that section of Carlin's book was not just the excellent reading list it gave me of books on and by a Greek thinker that I hadn't known about, but the use he made of that figure. His charting of the territory occupied at a historical moment by wisdom, rhetoric, oratory, argument, reasoning, persuasion, sophistry, and philosophy, sensitized this reader, at least, to the emotional impact of the connotations of the words we choose, as well as deepening my own understanding, I think, of what Carlin himself was doing in this book. If rational persuasion is one plausible understanding of what might be called philosophy, it is at home with, it is bordered by other varieties of persuasion, and the borders are not always as clearly agreed upon as it might seem, or as we might hope. In this conference, for instance, propaganda features as an important topic for public discourse, and it can be easily seen, I think, as falling within the Isocratean landscape. They too inform me about where to look and what to look for in this new Greek hero. We like to think that rational persuasion is the philosopher's turf and ours alone. The various shades of public intellectuals instanced in Carlin's book suggest a wider range of application than the professionalized discipline. Entitling his book America the Philosophical, Carlin may have had several objectives in mind, not only paying homage to the lively intellectual life of the country, but also by an imaginative re-expansion of the range of things to which the term philosophy can be usefully and to varying degrees, admittedly, appropriately, applied to counter any tendency to think of it as an isolated, hyper-professionalized, and irrelevant discipline. Insofar as that is one, if not of his intentions, at least as its effect, it's an optimistic book, I think. Optimistic and positive about philosophy under some description, as well as optimistic about America under some description. The America about which Carlin is optimistic is not a consistent America. It's not an America that does everything right. It's not an America that instantiates or often even does very well Rawlsian notions of justice as fairness. But it is an America that offers, through its many varied forums and outlets, lots of opportunity for public discourse and lots of encouragement to engage in what Rorty called the conversation of mankind. I can't resist a comment about that optimism. Carlin, I'm really glad you wrote the book when you did. I love its ending up with Obama as philosopher-in-chief. I wish Richard had lived to see that as a possibility. Like most of my generation, I've become used to thinking of the golden age as lying in the past, but I'm not used to thinking of that golden age as having been as recently as 4 years in the past. Carlin, if you seem to be as optimistic now as you were when you wrote that book, and I admire you for it. What about style? If you Google Carlin, which of course we all did, among the 18,000 hits on his name, there's a lot of discussion. Oh, we're in trouble. There's a lot of discussion of the style in which the book is written, and a lot of ambivalence about it. Jim Fleming remarks that it's a book in which people discover thinkers they never looked at before, introduced in a concrete way that makes them interesting. Certainly it includes anecdotes and impressions and analyses, even of thinkers that I had looked at before, or that I found interesting or provocative or illuminating or controversial, or just good, clean fun. Some called it capacious, some called it audacious, one called it sprawling. Jonathan Rhee, a British philosopher who I think of as a friend of the family, described the book and its author in a way that I found very sympathetic. He describes Carlin as a voracious reviewer, a tenacious reporter, and an enthusiastic interviewer. And he says of America the Philosophical that it's a likable book, but some people are going to hate it. As John noted, indeed, some people probably do. I count myself among those who really liked it. And come on, Carlin, if nobody really hated it, you weren't doing it right. Or at least that's the family tradition in my family. At some point when people were laying the number of their social science index citations out on the table and measuring them, Rorty not only proudly pointed to the rather large number of his own citations, he added, and most of them are negative. So, what is philosophy anyway? Just as my Dewey or James or Socrates is the real Dewey or James or Socrates, so philosophy is what I say it is, what I include on my accepted reading lists. Carlin has a pretty long list. Try philosophers, philosophy as thinkers, intellectuals, serious thinking and thinkers, civilized discourse, public deliberation, engagement with the problems of the day, rational persuasion, attainment of intersubjective or attempts to attain intersubjective agreement. Not everyone on his list is an academic philosopher, although some are. Not every academic he interviews and admires is in our discipline. A wide variety of what I think of as his public intellectuals are academics in other disciplines. And Carlin has a very wide disciplinary reach. Fairly importantly, at this moment in history, he treats as in some sense philosophers people who, imagine this, aren't academics at all. Many of us have or are working towards our union card, a PhD or in an established academic philosophy department. But Romano's book suggests that that is neither a necessary nor, heaven help us, a sufficient condition to earn a place as a participant in philosophy as a conversation of mankind, as Rorty might have envisaged it. Word about the context. This is a really interesting panel to have at an APA meeting, and I congratulate the organizers for their prescience in having it. Romano's book is pretty hard on the elite philosophers club of which he's a dues-paying member. The books, indeed, a few years old, as John has noticed. Have things changed much? Changing our world by changing our language, expanding or narrowing what the words we use connote or denote, is a nicely pragmatic, indeed perhaps even a Rortian way to approach social change, if you're interested in that. Transformation of our vocabulary through redescription changes our world as lived. Changing practices, of course, can also change our world. There are signs that there are some very energetic top-down efforts to change the organizational culture of the APA at the moment. Have things changed much in this bastion of elite privilege since you wrote the book, Carlin? At the moment, all three divisions may have female presidents. I'm not sure because I avoided, although I went to Eastern Division, I didn't go to Central. And there's certainly a lot of Asian philosophy on this program. I went to the business meeting at Eastern Division APA a few months ago. There was only one other tourist in the room, Judy Wubnick, a Canadian philosopher at Waterloo. And she rose after the presentation of the material under new business to accuse the APA of waging war on the poor, beleaguered white males who were being driven out of the association for the sake of women and minorities. I understand the divisions do count these things, and it may be possible to get statistics that are, 4 years more contemporary than those that Carlin cited. I noticed in my informal count of the gender distribution in the list of program participants at the end of the program that the percentages are still pretty much the same as those Carlin cited. But, mind you, they are certainly no worse than the gender distribution at the American Geographical Society meeting at this moment in the Hilton right down the street. And there's a discouraging, I think, continuity in the content as well. Every time I come to the APA, and I've been coming to the APA at least once a year for about 5 decades now, I'm stunned at how many papers have exactly the same title and subject, albeit different authors, than they had when I first started coming to the APA. But there are some signs that the organizational culture, along with the times, may be attempting to undergo some change. What do you think, Carlin? Maybe they read maybe some of the members of the board read your book. Before I close, I'd like to add one name to the genealogy between Isocrates and Rorty that Carlin is drawing. One of the few people, actually, who's not in his extensive bibliography, although he does occur in the index. And that's the pragmatist Randolph Bourne. Born in 1886 and dying in 1918, he was an early pragmatist and a progressive left intellectual. He did not produce any systematic theory or magnum opus, but he was an inveterate writer of passionate, critical, thoughtful essays on many of the subjects treated in Carlin's book. I was recently introduced to him through the offices of Sepp Gumbrecht at Stanford Comparative Literature Department, Dick's equivalent at Stanford of the role that E.D. Hirsch played for him at the University of Virginia. Sepp has run a weekly philosophy discussion group for 2 decades now. And last quarter, Randolph Bourne was the subject. I was struck by how many of the problems he sees and writes about, the quality and interests of the undergraduates, the invidious effects of money on universities, corporate culture, insufficient attention by anybody to the plight of the poorer of our citizens. How many of those are the same subjects, the same problems that beset us today? The more things change, in some ways, the more they stay the same. One of Carlin's reviewers, a guy named David Roddick, who I don't even know, said of the book, "If Rorty is a third wave, Romano's book represents a fourth wave, a contemporary example of what Rorty envisaged as philosophy and the conversation of mankind." John's point about whether it's in fact a contribution to the tradition of pragmatism and thus to the history or the perpetuation of philosophy, I think that I disagree here, and I'm arguing that it really is.
All right, we'll have another chance for Carlin to make some comments on Mary's paper.
Mary, I cannot tell you, how grateful I am for your being here. We go back a long way, but it's really an honor for me that you agreed to do this, and it really kind of closes a circle for me, with Dick. One of the problems with publishing a book in your 50s that you had hoped to publish in your 30s or 40s is that a lot of your mentors are gone. I would have loved for Johnny Smith to have seen this book, for Dick to have seen this book. Of course, life is always on the one hand. On the other hand, a lot of my enemies are gone. So, so you have to. I can only imagine what Ruth Marcus would have thought of this book. She would have had a letter to the Times within 5 minutes. Even though, like with Jason, I got along fine with Ruth when we weren't talking about philosophy. But I have to say, I laughed out loud in my room when I read your observation, Mary, about how it's the same topics with different authors at the APA, because I've noticed that also, and I think that's one of the sadnesses, of the profession. When I did have that battle with Jason at Harvard, the title of that symposium was, "Is There Progress in Philosophy?" I think I'm going to send Jason a little note about the matter of titles at APA meetings. When you say Romano places Rorty where he'd like to be placed, boy, does that make me happy. It does, because he was such an inspiration to me, and I learned so much from him, and particularly stylistically, with a father who was a journalist and a mother who also wrote journalism. I think I threw this line in the book that he learned how to knock it out, and I learned something about writing philosophy from him. But I'm also very appreciative that you point out that it's not a hagiographic chapter, and that when we did talk about philosophy, we disagreed about a lot of things. I mean, I was always making fun of him for his use of eponymous adjectives, from philosophers' names. That this is a Habermasian twist on a Heideggerian Platonic, retort to Parmenides. And I say, and name dropper, right? And I thought, I once said to him, you remind me of our pop music critic, who's always saying that this band is if, like the Rolling Stones had gone to Sweden and picked up some Serbo-Croatian, rhythms. And I said, nobody knows what that means, because it's all one little part. So we disagreed about some things, such as the importance of the word philosophy and the traditional kind of prestige and respect attached to that word. But, I came to feel that maybe, he also appreciated that, and yet it was a kind of rhetorical move to try to devalue the capital P philosophy at some point when he was fighting the establishment. Now, you mentioned too this idea of trying to make your work better understood by continually looking for new, vocabularies. And, I think I've come to understand in intellectual life that no matter how you say anything, some people are going to disagree with it. There is no final vocabulary in a different sense that he meant that's ever going to persuade everyone. But if I remember right, Mary, after Dick passed away, we exchanged emails, and I think you said something to me like, he always felt that if he found a new way of saying it, that there would, more people would understand and sort of kick in. I think you need that, as an intellectual and as a writer to keep going. Because, if you do your first book and people disagree and you think, well, that's it. I said it in the only way it could be said, it's over. Another point you raised that I want to mention is the whole idea of rational persuasion as against other possible varieties of persuasion. And one thing that did have an impact on me in his later work was Rorty's attention to the way art could change people's minds and narratives could change people's minds, movies and novels. And that's why I've always found the condescension to journalism within philosophy quite funny, because there are academics in philosophy who think, oh, a movie could change your mind, and that's fine. And maybe a great symphony might change your mind about something, but a work of journalism couldn't. That's sort of, below the standard of any kind of persuasive activity. So I think it's something, I think in our discipline, and I'm sorry to say this, but in many of the rooms of this hotel and simultaneous sessions, there's a kind of impoverished notion of persuasion taking place between people who agree on many, many things already and then are battling about minutia. you know. And so I hope if my book has some, you know, impact, that part of that impact is a broader view of persuasion, how it can be accomplished, and so on. You mentioned my optimism. I think, as I told you, my mother thought it was hardwired into me. I always see the glass half full in almost every situation. But I do feel optimistic even in this political campaign where people think public discourse has been degraded. It was never a part of the argument of my book. I felt that there aren't stupid people in America, there's not debased discourse, and so on. And in my back and forth with Susan Jacoby, who wrote the book The Age of American Unreason, I tried to make the point, okay, you can cite a lot of low-grade publications, TV shows, reality stuff. I can cite higher grade ones, you know, so I'll give you Charlie Rose and you give me something really Dumbo like the Kardashians. But the point is, the higher level stuff is there. You go, and if you think of America as a philosophical culture, empirically, number of philosophy journals, number of philosophy professors, diversity of thought traditions available in the bookstores, degree of freedom of expression. Empirically, I think the argument stands. I was trying to make an argument beyond that empirical data, but that's come up, you know, sometimes. So I don't mind that the book is hated. I agree completely. I expected a lot of people to hate it or feel violated by it, and that was part of the point of doing it that way. The last thing you mentioned, I want to just say a couple of words on that before we open up the conversation about what is, you know, philosophy and how you persuade people. I do have a big sign in my office, one of these things that, you know, you pick up at a bric-a-brac store in New Hope or someplace that says, "Because I said so." And I have it behind me, so when I'm sitting with students, they say, you know, "Because I said so." To sort of get them in the mood of thinking like, well, do I have to believe it because he said so, or can I question it, and so on? And I think partly this is an answer to the idea of what the connection is that Jackie raised with people in the book. You know, I did put some people in the book to be provocative. My dear Umberto Eco, who died recently, just a wonderful, wonderful man who came through for me with a blurb for the book, and not just a blurb, like 2 pages of commentary on the book, said to me, "Oh, you know, Carlino, I really like it, but Hugh Hefner, you are going to have a problem with Hugh Hefner," right? Well, you know, I threw in Hugh Hefner because actually Hugh Hefner wrote scores and scores of essays for his own magazine, arguing for sexual freedom and liberation. He actually gathered it in a book. I was trying to be provocative by suggesting this. So in fact, you know, I worked very hard to find a photo of Hugh Hefner in which he looks like Bertrand Russell. You know, he's got a pipe and a hat, because if you look for photos of Hugh Hefner, 99% of all photos of Hugh Hefner, he's surrounded by 27 bunnies. So it's hard to find anything, right? But no, I mean, to make this serious point, he wrote all of these essays. Everyone who knows him and dealt with him knows he's been a great champion of free expression, even beyond sexuality. You know, he championed black jazz musicians, was the first to bring many of them on TV, endowed an award for them. And in fact, the Bertrand Russell Society, I learned in the course of doing this book, has often considered him for the Bertrand Russell Prize. You know, of course, they were both Randy types. I mean, Hefner's still around, so there's another connection there, right? But the idea with Hefner was he put these together. I think on eBay, you can buy the Playboy Philosophy. It's like 400 pages or so. So there's kind of that textual argument too, but how much did the rest of his empire open up views of sexuality, some of them not so great, some of them misogynist, but others, I think, liberational. You know, so I wanted to toss that out and say, well, so why is he not a philosopher? Because he also made 150 million? Or, you know, because he outrages your taste in certain matters and so on? So I think that was true of other people I put in the book too. You know, Robert Fulghum, who was a popular writer, everything you wanted to, you know in kindergarten, turned out to be a Wittgenstein type. He read all of Wittgenstein when I interviewed him. And he was trying to communicate insights in a very simple way, right? So he was kind of choosing this genre of pop philosophy, even though he himself was a much more sophisticated, erudite thinker. So yeah, I think, you know, the issue of philosophy remains wide open, but we have to be sensitive to how many different genres you can do philosophy in. And I even, with my students, I'm often saying, consider aphorisms. Can you consider aphorisms as expressions of philosophy? Aphorisms put together, aphorisms independently. And the very last thing I'll say before we open up the conversation, because this came up in different descriptions of my book by the reviewers, the New Yorker said that my book was a comprehensive intellectual history from, Emerson to Rawls. That taught me, a longtime book reviewer, that there are a lot of people who think big and comprehensive are synonyms. My book is not comprehensive, it is big. So, thank you.
Okay, so I want to definitely thank our final speaker for not showing up, which will give us plenty of time for conversation. So let's now open this up and get some comments. Probably, I think it would be best to start with our audience members and then let this go down So is there anything that you guys would like to?
I just wanted to show that I have the deluxe edition myself, and there's some of us who will want that. I've met Carlin before. My name is David Nichols, and I'm David Nichols, and Vice President for the Osprey Society. And I enjoyed the book very much. And I often had this sense as a student that, going through my philosophy degrees, that my professors had no clue what was going on outside the building, and there's something wrong with that, and that they needed to get a sense of what that was. And at any rate, there are a number of things that I really enjoyed about the book, including the chapter on Socrates kind of crystallized it all for me. But I noticed a lot of the examples that come up are moral examples, social examples, obviously public discourse issues with Socrates and so on. I wanted to ask you more specifically about ontology. Is there an ontology of America the philosophical, or ontologies that we could speak of more, and conceptions of the real, and of course we could use religious examples. We could talk about religion and public discourse in America, but actually I was thinking maybe even going beyond that. Is there a lot that could be added to what you're already doing, which your already excellent book, with regards to different conceptions of reality that are American? Did you want to say anything about ontological matters?
So I'd say, I certainly give the short end of the stick to metaphysics and ontology in the book, and I guess that's partly a matter of my anti-epistemological attitude that I express in the book. A number of people, there have been something like 50 to 60 reviews of this book, and a lot of people, especially in the mass public marketplace, have thought that I have nothing but derision for the concept of knowledge and issues of existence and so on. And that's not the case. It's really, in my mind, what I don't like is artificial epistemology. I mean, as a journalist, we're dealing with knowledge all the time. Throughout my career, whether I was a foreign correspondent in Russia or a book critic trying to figure out what a book is saying, I had to tie down facts. And I had to think about what authorities count for fact. You think of ontology. Ontology is about being, about what exists. Well, sometimes what exists is a matter of opinion, and sometimes it's not. And I continue to find in analytic philosophy not all things bad, but many of the discussions of issues of existence and of knowledge enormously artificial, in part because they show no respect for the authority structures of knowledge in the world. In other words, I may think that Guangzhou is the capital of China, but China thinks the capital of China is Beijing, and it's not really an equal ball game there, right? And there are a lot of things that by convention are clear-cut and factual and so on, right? Does opposition to President Xi in China exist or not exist? Well, that's a funny question in regard to existence, right? Is that an ontological question, right? So I actually ignored a lot of metaphysics and ontology and epistemology in the philosophy profession because I find it artificial. But in my wider intellectual life, I'm constantly dealing with issues of existence, right, and of knowledge, but in a much more practical, I would say pragmatist way. Inquiry keeps going, consensus matters, but it may only be for now. The consensus may change. So I do really think like a pragmatist in my philosophy and my journalism. You know, and one reason I've taught philosophical problems of journalism in the way I have is that I think that combination of a pragmatist understanding about knowledge and a journalist's understanding of the role authority plays is the combination you need to be able to represent the world and communicate truth to people.
All right, did anybody else want to chime in? Yeah, go ahead. Please do.
I'm reminded that we're at a philosophy conference, especially in hearing Carlin Romano's response to my comments. I found your comments remarkably oriented toward precision, and my comments about the ways in which your philosophy supports a philosophy of direction, and your own philosophy, your own orientation toward the profession, in which you do take critiques of its orientation toward precision. And so here are some particulars on this, that your three comments on the things that I brought up, on three of the things I brought up, are oriented toward boundary questions about words. My word unphilosophical. You said you bristled at the word that you want to keep philosophy alive. I agree with that. I agree that you're doing that, and I also hold that the term unphilosophical is a way of popping out the way in which you do that. And it is a way of doing that drew for its opening story from popular culture. So did I engage in something that I forget which one of my colleagues mentioned this? Did I kill my philosophical audience by using a reference to popular culture? I think it was just an opening story, and even within that story, 7-Up is a cola, and your unphilosophy is a philosophy, for sure.
Thank you.
There's no question about that, but it seems to me that debates on the boundary questions of who's really the philosopher is important, especially for a conference like this. But it seemed to me that you had bigger game, that you were up to something bigger, and I think as much culturally exciting as philosophically important. I think you're up to something that I was endorsing and actually looking for ways to support what you're up to and maybe even press for something further in, for example, talking about ways in which direction is at least as important as precision. And the boundary question you brought up there, that, I do support precision. I do too, and I thought you did too, and I thought I was as well, saying that some directional philosophy for its broad purposes for a public may actually draw in some of its hearers into being precise philosophers. So none of these terms, I think, should be treated as toggle switches, yes or no, but to be thought of on a spectrum. And in a similar way for the marketplace, I agree with you that the role of the market is something to pay attention to take seriously, and that it is significant, that we shouldn't just dismiss it. I just want to look at another side of the spectrum, that attention to the marketplace does have a tendency to bring on commodification. And that is a potential danger. Does that mean we should go to the other end of the toggle switch and say, oh, don't get engaged in the marketplace? Not at all. Draw from it, but as you do, be wary, be aware. I was also struck that I didn't hear a comment from your response to my comments on what I thought was the most hearty endorsement of what you're up to, which were the portions drawing upon William James, in which James endorses an approach to sentiments of rationality. What a wonderful oxymoron, that there are sentiments in our rationalities, so that the philosophies of precision, when they often have dismissed sentiments as just thoughts on holidays, the poor thoughts, not sufficiently rigorous. But that what James is getting at, that I thought you were getting at, or things that could support what you're getting at, that sentiments to rationality actually support ways of thinking of being America the philosophical. I think also of various ways in which my colleagues have made reference without the name to what I was calling directional philosophy. Maybe it's not the best name, but I propose that thinking in directional ways, thinking for orientation, has a purposefulness in philosophizing that is a significant distinction from precision. And it's not either or. In fact, I think of it more like an accordion, that you come in for the most precision, such as many of the philosophers that you reckoned with, who said, in effect, in one way or another, I don't care about the public. There's a place for that. But there's also a place for philosophizing that provides orientation, or as some of my colleagues mentioned, a philosophy that challenges assumptions, a philosophy that brings critical reflection, a philosophy that brings some education to the public. Try doing that with only precision. It doesn't mean it has to be a toggle switch of either or, but it does mean that there's a place for directional thinking. And if someone else has a better word for describing that kind of orienting thinking, bring it on. I welcome that. You've all offered various ideas that I think allude to that, support that, and point to that. But I do think it's something that has a value, not instead of precise thinking, but as another place for it, for different purposes, for different audiences. But it too is America, the philosophical. And I think that can support your work. So sally forth. As I said, sally forth, Professor Romano.
Sally Forth sounds to me like a professor who's on another panel somewhere in the building, but I do take the point. I know, I understand, you know, we've talked a lot in the past, Paul, and I know you're very supportive of my approach. I was really, in my kind of simplistic journalistic way, making 2 points about the unphilosophical, really rhetorical points. One, that because in my introduction I'm talking about America, the unphilosophical, that can be a confusion for, you know, in thinking about my book, because I've invoked that phrase myself, but in a different way. And the second, which is a broader case of just the way my ear hears things in American culture, that the moment you say unphilosophical about something that I recognize, you recognize, see as philosophical, the public will miss the second part. You know, it's just like, this just isn't philosophical, it's not at that level, it's not sophisticated enough, it's not persuasive enough, it doesn't include evidence, it's not rational. So all of that, so it's just my judgment call that even though it's not the popular culture aspect, I love that, I invite that, but I think that particular connection from uncola to unphilosophical doesn't work with my particular situation. With the directional matter, I think I said to you when we were talking the other day that I see it as connecting to that very old and wonderful philosophical tradition that philosophy is about how to live. And in the Kierkegaardian way, you live forward, you think backwards and reflect backwards, but you think forward. And some of that will be precise, some of it won't. I don't have anything more complex to say about precision and lack of precision than that it depends. Now, I was in some kind of highbrow conference a few weeks ago at Stanford, and the billionaire who was running it asked us, so what's your takeaway from everything that we've done? And I said, it depends. Very short sentence.
Be prepared for ambiguity.
I don't think he liked it.
Did you get paid?
Yes, I don't think he liked it. I said, wait a second, I put all this money into this stuff for you to say it depends? But in effect, we were talking about hierarchy and inequality, and it depended on how you constructed these terms and so on.
And situations.
Yeah, so I'm,
Purposes. Different purposes.
yeah. So I mean,
Pragmatic.
yeah, it's a mix. I agree with you completely. I think we're just using different vocabularies.
Boundary
Yeah,
issues.
yeah. But I think there are places for precision, there are places for imprecision. But I am interested to know a little. There's one other thing you mentioned that I don't understand that well, which is the commodification point with the market. Are you saying that when you deal with the market?
It means that you should give your books away for free instead of actually getting paid for the
Oh,
product.
okay. Open up. I hereby declare. Well, actually, I've been preempted on this because my book I think cost 27 cents off some Shanghai site, and it's been pirated all over the place. So I've been beaten to the punch there, right? But I wondered whether you were suggesting at all that just by dealing with the market, and here I'm talking about marketplace of ideas in my mind, that you are automatically turning what you're doing into a product so that the product concerns actually outweigh your, say, devotion to truth and so on. So I'm going to say certain things in my book so it will sell better, or it won't piss off various, people. And I had many cases in this. I'll mention my good friend Brian Leiter, where I had choices to make about how to say certain things, and I said what I thought, and that caused some problems.
Yeah. Well, I did just want to say one thing on the commodification idea, and that is, in short, it depends.
Okay.
But what I mean is, it's not either or that what you're doing is potential for commodification and therefore, watch out. But that your approach to the marketplace is important for opening up, for flexibility, for popularity, for reaching an audience, but it can have a potential price. It's not to say don't do it. Go for it. That's the Sally Forth I meant. That's a serious comment.
What's the price?
The price is the potential when reaching a broad audience that it could offer a watering down. It has potential. That is what happens when items become commodified, that they become elements in the marketplace that goes to the highest bidder. It has that potential. It's just something to watch for. I go back to the toggle switch. It's not an either or, because popularity will involve a marketplace. You are involved with that, but there is potential there's still something to watch for.
But if I may ask you, with a book, think about a book. Okay. With a book, how does that commodification affect a book of philosophy, right? In other words, are you suggesting that the author dumbs down the book because he's thinking of it as a commodity? In my case, for instance, really, I didn't care at all about the commercial aspects of the book. I just wanted to put together this thing that I've been thinking for a very long time.
Right.
Everything else was gravy. The mere fact that the object exists finally is so satisfying compared to sales or anything like that. So I feel as if I didn't have, in that sense, a commodification mentality at all. But are you suggesting, if we think specifically of a book and it's going out into the marketplace of ideas, that and this brings in, John's points about trade publishing, that when you go into the broader intellectual marketplace, you're likely to commodify any more than if you publish an Oxford University Press book that you want to appeal to the market of analytic epistemologists? Because I don't think there's actually much difference in commodification there.
Well, they're each appealing to different markets. Of course they are. And I think John put this very well in addressing the challenges of reaching a different marketplace. You just referred in your last comments to the way in which, that in effect, you could use market language to talk about what philosophers do. They are appealing to the marketplace that fellow philosophers think about. We could use that language. That sure. And in reaching a broader audience, John put it very well on what different kind of appeals are needed for reach trade publications. And when that happens, it's just life has potential trade-offs. And I was only offering a word of warning, not a critique, not a dismissal, not saying don't do it. In fact, that's why I use the word sally forth to do this. But as you do, seek audience, but be prepared for the potential for having to lose some things in precision. It has that potential.
All right, let's get some more comments here.
So I just wanted to respond or ask you to clarify. When you said you didn't think about the sales, I just don't believe you, in the sense that you're going with a publisher, an outstanding publisher, and you're doing it. I can't imagine that you're not doing it in part strategically, in the sense that the book that you wrote is perfectly fitted to that press, and that press then knows how to turn, or should know how to turn, that book into something that lots of people will read. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with picking a press carefully, and you did. And so I'm kind of wondering, what do you mean when you said I'm not worried about sales numbers? Because you probably are not worried about sales number in a sort of like crass, I want to make $1 million on this book. But you might be worried about, and very genuinely worried about, how many people are actually taking me seriously. What sort of difference are my words making? And when I'm writing now, I really think I'm genuinely thinking about how many people can I speak to, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So I'd like you to sort of clarify about what you meant.
And speak to who will grasp what you're saying.
Yeah. So no, this is a wonderful opportunity to have this conversation, because I feel that you're working territory that I've tried to work in for a long time and doing it very successfully. So here we are. I managed to publish my book, right, with Alfred A. Knopf, which everybody recognizes as one of the two most prestigious trade publishers in the United States, the one that all the big people go to first, presidents and so on. You're publishing with Farrar, Straus and Giroux, the other great trade press, right? So there are expectations, and you are among very, highly anointed people, Nobel Prize winners and all of that, which also means you're a pipsqueak if you're not a Nobel Prize winner and so on. Let me give you an example with my book. So there are photographs in my book, right? Like the photograph of Dick and his daughter, which Mary happily, provided. It never occurred to me in 10 years of working on this book that there would be photos or pictures in my book. They sprung that on me, right? And when I asked why, and I had to get them, and I had to pay for them out of my advance and all of that, and I'd say, why? So, to broaden it to a wider audience. I say, do you think it's going to be a coffee table book except the size of a bottle of coffee or something? They said, no, we just think photos and pictures will broaden it. So I remember thinking, okay, is that going to kill me with all the intellectuals and philosophers? Nobody will take the book seriously because that's in there? And I came to the conclusion that it wouldn't. They did give me the option of saying no, but they urged me, right, to say yes. I would distinguish between the two things you mentioned, as I think you were distinguishing yourself. Purely commercial concern about sales and being taken seriously. I very much wanted to be taken seriously. But if someone had come to me, the best thing I think that has happened to me in my whole intellectual life with this book was getting the front page of the New York Times Book Review, right, and 2 internal pages. Lucky, because nobody gets that automatically. Things just worked out that way, right? If you had said to me, you're going to get that and you're going to sell 500, oh, great. You could sell 5. Just give me that front page of the New York Times Book Review, right? Obviously, they're connected. Then you get the front page, you're going to have sales, right? But I honestly didn't care at all about whether I made back my advance. That's their problem at the publishing house and so on. I just wanted people to read the book seriously, respond to it, for it to have an intellectual impact and so on. So I totally agree with you that you have to care about who's reading you. I care much more about the quality of the people reading me than how many millions might be reading me. And with sales still, I mean, I feel that I don't care. I really don't, and only if sales meant somehow that you get wider intellectual attention, but I don't think they do. I don't think they make much of a difference for that.
Okay, any other questions? So I have a question. When it seems like one of the things that we are talking about is public philosophy and a specific public, America, that and its relationship to philosophy. So I wanted to ask the panel what your thoughts are on the capacity for a public to philosophize, and the second half of that question is the role of philosophers as members of a public. So do you have, for instance, do you have to be American to care about America, the philosophical? Do you have to be a member of that public? What about Canadians and Latin Americans and all the other people that are close in proximity to America and might have philosophical viewpoints that would like to enter into this intellectual marketplace?
Yes, I do think the American public is capable of engaging in philosophical discussion. We had a session last night in which we had some community members, including business people, come to a session on Josiah Royce's work on loyalty, in which they found his ideas very intriguing in terms of financial and building an ownership culture and so on and so on. So yes, I think the public is quite capable of engaging in fact, I think they're thirsty, many part of the public, to deal with some serious ideas. And our professional philosophers have failed and you mentioned ontology. You mentioned the same topics in the APA. I mean, how many times do we need to talk about whether, the mind-body problem and whether there's free will, and we say the same thing over and over and over and has absolutely no relationship to everyday living. And of course, the pragmatist, Royce has a wonderful, he said, philosophy is about reflecting on what you do, and what you do is live. And so I think that's public philosophy. Whether others from the American public that aren't American can speak to that, I don't see any reason why someone can't comment on America and what we are as a country. I don't think it has to be. And then we did talk about, I mentioned in my written comments in the Stone, in which he talks about, throughout the history of philosophy, there have been people who have played a public role. I'm just reading a very exciting book about Isaac Newton, who considered himself a philosopher and not a scientist, and we tend to forget that. So it isn't not unusual for philosophers to be in the public.
Yeah, this gets back to the question of what you're doing in terms of how you use the term philosophy and what it applies to. Clearly, in my view, the range and implications of the term as you use it does allow for, and indeed necessitate, public conversations and public involved in the conversations and things of general interest. So that seems to me something that your book did very well.
I want to call attention to something that Jackie wrote in her piece but wasn't able to present here, which was an article that Scott Soames did for The Stone. in the New York Times, which I disagreed with very, very strongly. As you know, if you've read my book, I don't have a problem attacking people once in a while, so I think I'll attack Scott a little bit. I remember Scott at Princeton as somebody who I thought very much honored and revered the analytic philosophical tradition and wanted to be a part of it. And to my eye, he's kind of written the same book many times now about analytic, philosophy and revering it. And he wrote this piece for the Times in which I thought he did not distinguish well the difference between a philosopher being public by being interested in other disciplines and interacting with other disciplines, and then the public beyond disciplines. So he's talking about Tarski and Carnap and so on, and connections with science and physics and so, and it seemed like that's enough. And of course those things had practical consequences, the logic of the times with computers and so on. So that's a separate issue. Nobody, I think, who's sensible about intellectual history thinks those things didn't play out in practical consequences in a good way. But he had this wonderful line, and I wrote this down because in case it came up, Jackie, in your presentation, in that article, Scott says, despite the often repeated idea that philosophers' true calling can only be fulfilled in the public square, philosophers actually function best in universities. Okay? So, I thought, if you've lived your whole life in a university, you may honestly believe that. But the problem with living your whole intellectual life in a university is that you are not challenged in a way that people are challenged in the public intellectual marketplace. I was challenged much more as a newspaper man by copy editors and editors saying, that's not true, I don't think that's right, you're using a word in a way that's not familiar to me and not convincing to me. Much different from the kind of back scratching that often takes place in academic settings like this convention, where people don't criticize something because they want to get invited to the other person's university, or they want to keep a good relationship with their colleagues. I think there's a lot more honesty in criticism in the public intellectual, marketplace. And so, I think the dialogue of philosophy must go outside the university if it's going to be stronger and get closer to the truth. And politicians have to be involved, and lawyers and scientists and bus drivers and musicians. They all have something to contribute.
And I just want to say, if philosopher only functions in the university, going back to Royce's quote that philosophy is about life, I can't imagine if that's life is all about, forget it, right?
Well, this is a good reminder that everyone has a philosophy. And I think that this is an underlying drumbeat of everything that we're talking about here, even though we are in an organizational structure right now of the Organizational Guild of Professional Philosophers. But everyone has a philosophy. And when engaging in philosophical discourse, books and articles, any form of verbal expression by philosophers or others, are essentially on the turf that you've introduced of what is the capacity for a public philosophy. On that turf, there are essentially two kinds of writings. One form of writing says, you come to me. And another form of writing says, I'm going to go to you. And I think what we're talking about here, in terms of function, in terms of how things operate, is that much academic philosophy, for many good purposes, and there are many good purposes for engaging like this, engage in a kind of discourse that says, you come to me. But what I take as what you're getting at, and what I take as an important part of the pragmatic tradition, as some of my colleagues expressed very eloquently, and the original pragmatists expressed with iconic eloquence, was to say, there's also a way to philosophize that will go to you, that won't say, I'm patronizing and dismissive of the philosophy that you have already, but I might be able to provide some enrichment because you're busy as a policeman and a bus driver, and you have your philosophy, but you may not have had a time to think about these other things. Can philosophy also, in addition to the precision it does in its academic work, can it also spend some time helping, enriching, uplifting what the philosophies that people have, but that they may not have had available to them some enriching capacities from philosophers? I think that's what pragmatism is up to. I think that's the suggestion that Isocrates opens the door to, and that's what I think is so enriching about your book, that it opens those doors to what philosophy can do for the philosophers who are general citizens.
I guess I have a question for Mary and for Carlin, and I know the answer. I'd express it to the entire panel, but I already know the answer because I already asked them privately. So I'm going to ask you, and because I think I'm curious, and because it might be helpful to when you write a book like the one you did, what do you do after that? So my question is, what are you going to be doing? What are you working on now? And how does it relate to, and both of you, I'm curious to know, how does it relate to your earlier scholarship, and how does it relate to public philosophy, or at all? And I'd like to ask both of you that.
For me, there's a rather specific answer. Carlin in the Rorty chapter talks about one of the consequences of what he calls Rorty's revolution is breaking down the obsession with epistemology, and one of the consequences of that was a flourishing of what either should or should not be called applied philosophy. That is to say that philosophers, as well as some theologians and some other extraordinarily inappropriate abstract thinkers, entered into hospitals, into businesses, into various areas, and started applying the skills, the interests, and the accomplishments that they had trained themselves to do to areas of real life. When we left Princeton and moved to the University of Virginia, and I no longer had babies at the knee, I went off and got myself probably the first master's degree in clinical ethics that had ever been developed. I think there have been later ones since, but the University of Virginia at that point had John Fletcher establishing a program, and after having spent a number of years devouring 2,000 years of scholarship in 5 languages, it seemed to me really kind of neat and fun to actually go out and see if I could be of any use at all to hardworking people with their own expertise working to make people's lives better. And it's been fun. But after 20 years, what next?
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you mentioned the applied ethics movement, because I want to emphasize something again about public discourse and philosophy. There is something you're taught in graduate school that you should be perfectly on the one hand, on the other hand, in your fairness to sources and arguments and so on. But I think, Richard Hofstadter, the great American, historian somewhere, says that when you're going against the status quo, when you're trying to go against the grain of philosophical belief or cultural belief, you may need to exaggerate a little bit. You may need to put the emphasis on one side rather than another. So, I do put the emphasis on the artificial and bad things that are done in the philosophy profession. But I want to say there's a lot of good stuff that's done in this convention and in the philosophy, profession too. And applied ethics is an example.
And indeed, the presidential address last night was on the question of whether we should even use the word applied ethics or whether we should just say ethics.
Yeah, and I think, and maybe we've reached a point where we can drop the applied, but I think applied ethics was used because of the meta-ethical tradition that had developed so much in the middle of the 20th century. So everybody's talking about what's the meaning of right and what's the meaning of good, and people aren't talking about euthanasia, right? questions of disability, and so on. So I think the expansion of applied ethics is a wonderful thing. I wrote a piece for the Inquirer, Philadelphia Inquirer, years ago. I thought I knew all the applied ethics areas, and then I got a book on accounting ethics, which I knew, I thought more of lack of ethics in accounting, but I thought, oh my, somebody's actually studying this, a philosopher, and, so that's wonderful. In my own case, the book I'm working on now has the working title, Is There an Asian Philosophy, ? Which is meant to be provocative in the same way that this oxymoronic title was meant to be provocative. And I'm trying to think about the great Asian philosophical traditions and whether they make any sense or have any influence today in the world, in Asia or elsewhere. There are philosophers who think you can take Confucianism the way you took Christianity and expand it to other places. So a philosopher named Robert Neville who talks about Boston Confucianism. There's a very big issue, though, about whether these things have any force in Asia anymore in an age of globalization, and have they been flattened, right? So I'm actually looking at that in different countries and different traditions. And I recommend this to you, John, also if you end up wandering, beyond American philosophy. What I found is I am able to trade my expertise, such as it is in American philosophy, and go to Chinese universities and talk about the things I know, and therefore get the contact with these experts in Asian philosophy. So I've been at Peking University, and I'm going this summer to give lectures at Beijing Normal University. And I'm doing that as a kind of quid pro quo so that I can sit at the feet of these great experts and also experience the societies. Because like this book, that book, I hope will combine journalism and philosophy, have a lot of detail, a lot of concreteness, which again, I hope appeals to a broader readership of well-educated people. And again, I don't really care how much, if my publisher doesn't care how much it sells, I don't care how much it sells, as long as we get into print.
Okay, we have time for one more question, because I have one more question. So, that's right.
If you had two more questions, would we have time for two more questions?
We would totally have time for two more questions. Yes. Absolutely. So, John Dewey, who we've mentioned a number of times tonight, was confronted by the America of the last century and how its power and influence in the world tended to come from its technology and its way of selling that technology and its way of capitalizing on that technology. And I haven't heard this topic brought up yet, and although I know that all of the authors that we've talked about so far have addressed this concern. So America, so technology is the way that America expresses its philosophy, because all technologies are expressions of philosophy. And so I'd like to just get some comments from the panel on that aspect of this topic.
Well, I actually teach a course on technology and human values and so on, and one of the projects I've been working on lately is the impact of the internet and the phone on concepts of person and concepts of how you relate to others. And I think this is a very important question that a lot of people are raising, and I think philosophers need to get into and really bring some clarification and depth to it, because it is changing how we relate to each other. It's changing how we conceive each other. And, technology always does impact how we interrelate, but this is really a fundamental change in our culture, I think.
Very quickly, so I sort of, most of my work is in American intellectual history, but when the Obama administration ramped up their drone warfare program, I wrote a book on the ethics of drone warfare with a political scientist, and many people ask, like, why did you do that? That seems like a weird thing for you to write. But I think that Dewey's comment is very, it's still very much appropriate. And so I think going forward, I'm sort of going to be thinking about engineering ethics, which I think is going to be a really important thing moving forward, but also some of the ethical implications of military technologies.
Yeah, your question is a reminder of the idea that everyone is a philosopher and has a philosophy, but this brings it up in a rather pointed way, that dominant cultural orientations, the prevalence of technology and the significant influence of technology has a lot of tacit philosophy to it, but it is often presented in unreflective ways. And so that's why I did bring up the cyber philosophers in my comments, and the ways in which those ideas are being debated between those who are enthusiasts for the potential for cyber worlds to liberate and to bring showers of blessings on the modern and the postmodern world, and those who bring up all kinds of skeptical questions about that for reducing employment opportunities, for reducing freedom. And indeed, that is much of that philosophizing is taking place outside of formal philosophy and informal philosophy. But those illustrate examples of ways in which the call it unphilosophy, or call it America the Philosophical, or call it directional philosophy, these are ways in which philosophizing can be an enriching element, a leaven to our culture. So I really applaud what John has worked on, because he not only is a student of pragmatism, but he has engaged pragmatically in our contemporary world with its love affair with technology, in this case applied to warfare, and engaged in the uses of pragmatic thinking to think critically and questioningly about something that is happening, as in the sense that there's a tacit philosophy being brought about, and he's shedding a philosophical light on it to raise questions about it and to open up some more reflective ways of thinking about it, to pop out assumptions to raise critical questions about.
You know, John, I saw that you had that book on drones, and I immediately thought, why is he doing that? What's he thinking? I'm joking. I didn't think that. I thought, good for you. Really great topic, cutting edge topic, and I want to get a copy of it. We'll talk, right? But I think this is a perfect example, and I think it's brave of you to do that also, because it's right, it's not obvious, and you're right working your way up in academe. But it's a perfect example, though, of the way this profession, and we have to come back to the flaws here of the profession, ignores so much that is important in public life. So in America the Philosophical, I do have a long section called Gutenberg's Revenge, the explosion of cyber philosophy, talking about a lot of thinkers who are thinking about the effects of the digital revolution on ethics, journalism, romance, and so on. And I've been thinking of doing this a separate book, maybe, on that, and gave like 7 lectures at Beijing Foreign Studies University on 7 different areas of life affected by the digital revolution. Virtually nobody in that chapter is a philosopher. They're all coming out of this area, Silicon Valley, or they're in communications. If you go to ICA, the International Communication Association, lots of people thinking philosophically about this. So let me add one pathetic addition to that. For decades, I've been trying to teach philosophical problems of journalism and arguing that should be a staple course in philosophy departments. It's important. Philosophy hasn't even caught up to journalism. We teach a course. Thank you. Good. I'm glad there are a few. But, on the whole, compared to philosophy of law, philosophy of art, early modern, there's hardly any courses of that sort. So, I think it would be great if more people thought the way, you did, that this is an important topic. You can apply philosophy to it. Let's do things like this rather than the same old stuff.
Yeah, the metaphysics, the ontology, the aesthetics, the politics, and the ethics, of course, of technology. I mean, in one sense, it is as much a subject for philosophical exploration, even in the traditional sense. And I think, as we're all very aware, especially when you start talking about impact it may have on our sense of personal identity or our sense of interpersonal identity, an extremely important thing to be thinking about at this moment.
I just want to say the job that I have an honors student who I've been mentoring, who is an engineering student who is developing drones for pest control in agriculture, and we've had a number of interesting discussions about that, what that means in terms of, privacy and other kinds of things. And, they just not taught to think about these things as they're doing their engineering.
And of course, the cruel technology of clock time has caught up with us, and so has probably biological time. So I'm sure we are all a little tired, but we could go on if we weren't embodied individuals. We could live in a Platonic world of complete philosophical contemplation.
It would be virtual.
It would be virtual. Yeah, that's right. Brought to us by our friends in Silicon Valley. So with that, I'd like to close the session, and thank you all for very wonderful and thought-provoking session. Thank you very much.